My name is Alexis.
I'm Kelsey.
I'm Taylor.
There's Tyrone.
And we're doing our presentation on the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, written by Rebecca Skloot. Next slide. So this is an image of Henrietta Lacks, and it's also the image that is used on the cover of the book. Next slide. And then before going into our thoughts on the book, we're going to give a quick synopsis. So the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, talks about the person's life behind HeLa cells. HeLa cells were widely used around the world due to their immortality. They could survive and multiply in conditions cancer cells never could before. Hence, HeLa cells allowed researchers to gather substantial research on illnesses such as cancer, AIDS, polio, etc. Despite how widely used HeLa cells are in scientific research, the public never knew the woman behind HeLa cells, which is the author's goal in writing this book. The author discusses Henrietta's life and her family's lives before and after Henrietta's death from cervical cancer. We learn about the deceit Henrietta's family faced at the hands of doctors, researchers, and scientists who took Henrietta's cells and began sharing and experimenting on them without the family's knowledge. Ultimately, we learn about the women who paved the way for several scientific advancements. Next slide.
So I'm going to be talking about some of the implications of this book. Henrietta Lacks' cells forever changed science. With the first immortalized cell line, doctors and scientists sparked a major development in medical research. The HeLa cell line has created many advancements in medicine, and they are still being used today. Some of the things that these cells helped with were the development of polio vaccine, and also today even they are being used for like the COVID vaccine, but many advancements in medicine are to think because of the cells of Henrietta Lacks. Here's a quote from the book. The reason Henrietta's cells were so precious was because they allowed scientists to perform experiments that would have been impossible with a living human. They cut HeLa cells apart and exposed them to endless toxins, radiation, and infections. They bombarded them with drugs, hoping to find one that would kill malignant cells without destroying normal ones. Next slide.
So I also wrote about some implications, specifically the questionable ethics that went into the research that the scientists did with the HeLa cells. So Guy was a scientist who had her cells, and he was the one who originally made the culture of her cells that grew. And he had taken her cells without consent. And then from the book, there was a quote where it said he sent shipments of HeLa cells to researchers in Texas, India, New York, Amsterdam, and many places between. Those researchers gave them to more researchers who gave them to more still. First of all, it's questionable in his ethics in that he hid, if it was for his own personal research, taking her cells without consent. But then he took it and for monetary gain, sending it around the world to other scientists who sent it to other scientists for their monetary gain as well. And this exponentially increased the amount of people who were able to manipulate her cells without any knowledge of their true intentions. Another researcher who did a similar thing with ethics around HeLa cells was Chester Southam. He would test patients using HeLa cells under false pretenses. So there was a quote where it said, if he explained anything, he simply said he was testing them for cancer, and he believed he was. He would inject patients with HeLa cells, then they would grow tumors on various parts of their bodies. And this is so he could decide how it affected regular patients and ones with that already had cancer. And the issue with this is that they were under the assumption they were being tested, not injected with cancer cells, and that many people who did not already have cancer would deny the injection if they were told the truth.
So we've been given examples of some questionable ethics regarding how researchers used HeLa cells. So going off the same topic of ethics, throughout the book, we see a common theme of misleading the Lax family by hiding the real purpose for conducting research. For example, the moment Henrietta died, the doctors wanted to perform an autopsy on her to get more cells and just study her. At first, Mr. Lax was opposed, but when Henrietta died, they had agreed to let her doctors do an autopsy because they had told them it might help his children someday. So we can see that the doctors were not transparent in their reasons for conducting the autopsy on Henrietta. And then secondly, there's another example where the researchers wanted to study more about HeLa cells, and to do so, they needed blood from the Lax family. So to get blood, they kind of told the family they were testing for cancer. However, there was no such thing as a cancer test. And even if there had been, McCusick's lab wouldn't have been doing one because he wasn't a cancer researcher. McCusick was actually a renowned geneticist. So overall, throughout the book, we can see that individuals are easily susceptible to deception if they're not educated. Unfortunately, cancer was very taboo subject for the Lax family, and everyone sort of used that to their advantage, to take advantage of the Lax family and gain more like blood and cells to further their personal research. So cancer was like the main excuse to use to gather research on her family discreetly. Next slide.
So another implication and lesson that we can learn from this book, you really learn about the unethical treatment of African Americans. Henrietta Lacks received treatment at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, which was one of the only hospitals that treated for African American people at the time. And even though they were treating her for free, there were still things going on that they were taking advantage of these people, amongst them getting free treatment. So here's this quote from the book. It says, like many doctors of his era, Tilland often used patients from the public wards for research, usually without their knowledge. Many scientists believe that since patients were treated for free in the public wards, it was fair to use them as research subjects as a form of payment. And as Howard Jones once wrote, Hopkins, with its large indigenous Black population, had no dearth of clinical material. Next slide.
So another takeaway we got from the book is how it's important to be aware and well-informed about science and just scientific advancements in general. So here's a quotation from the class textbook that sort of explains why. If they aren't aware that they have a learning problem, they can't take steps to overcome it. So because the Lax family was not well informed, they were not actually able to comprehend all this information that they were getting in the papers or watching on TV that were talking about HeLa cells and all the experiments that the cells were being put through. And because of this, it caused some issues amongst the Lax family. So Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, for example, was deeply burdened because she thought her mother could actually feel the research that was being conducted on her cells. So in Deborah's case, her lack of awareness resulted in a misconstrued understanding of how science works. So because she was not well informed or fully aware of what was going on, it impacted her as a well-informed citizen, and it impacted her mentally and physically.
Another takeaway from the book was we had already talked about the significance of her cells today, and that they were given out freely, and that she was part of what helped us create the polio vaccine. But going off of that, there are some policies that exist in hospitals today, including informed consent, which was not given during Henrietta's time. So informed consent occurs when communication between a patient's physician results in the patient's authorization or agreement to undergo specific medical interventions. So this is basically having a patient and a doctor, or a person speak for the patient, sit down and get all the information possible in an accurate way, and then to understand their ability to receive that information, to make sure that they understand what's going to happen, and to document consent in written form. So if Henrietta's family or her were given information accurately, instead of saying that they were just going to test for cancer, or that her cells, or one example in the book was that she was never told that once she did radiation, she wasn't going to be able to have kids anymore. If that was all told to her in a correct way, they could have made their own decision regarding the cells, and the takeaways could have been completely different.
Could you go back one second?
Oh yeah.
I put on the top there just how it was a little bit related to today. I put that when her cells were given out to the world, they started out being free from scientists, and then they started selling her cells for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and her family actually doesn't get any piece of that money. So I found that pretty crazy. And I think it's because she's, African American, that they basically kind of take her idea and run with it. So I think, it's just crazy to me.
Okay, another takeaway is the importance of questioning what we think we know. I think that it's the saying knowledge is power is so important when it comes to this book, just knowing what's going on and questioning what's going on is really important. Back in the day, they weren't ones that would question their doctors or what they said. Like this quote states, there's no indication that Henrietta questioned him. Like most patients in the 1950s, she deferred to anything her doctor said. This was a time when benevolent deception was a common practice. Doctors often withheld even the most fundamental information from their patients, sometimes not giving them any diagnosis at all. And this also relates to texts that we read throughout the semester. I think a reoccurring topic that kept coming up in both Schools for Thought and How People Learn was the ability to question, and also to not only go off of the information that you originally started with, but also to be able to expand that information and to learn something new and learn as you go. And what's hard is that we have certain preconceptions about so many things in life, and then we learn something new that tests that information, and we can either change our point of view or stick to something that's incorrect. So it's, very beneficial to be able to expand and listen to others and other viewpoints and get in the information, and always continue to question and not just like take everything for what it's told. So from Schools for Thought, it states, the research suggests that we learn by modifying existing memory structures, such as production systems. Learning can occur when new situations challenge our current theories. In some cases, though, we can learn from new experiences only if we receive explicit instruction about how to represent or interpret those experiences. So just being able to learn, being able to question, being able to expand your mind to new information. I also have some more information on that. Yeah, just because we are told something from a seemingly reliable source does not mean that it is true. It's important to always think critically. This is all a part of how we become well-informed citizens. If we don't question, how do we become well-informed citizens? Next slide. Oh, this is me too. So some of the concluding thoughts and wonderings is, do the ends justify the means? And I think that most of us agree that though what happened, there's been a great deal of good that has come from it. Henrietta cells have contributed a great deal to research and to the development of modern medicine. The AIDS epidemic and polio, and researching cancer and how certain medicines are made, like all of that was because of Henrietta cells. And what's sad is that, Henrietta Lacks is not a widely known name, which it should be. Her name should be well known for everything she's contributed to this world. Though the lack of consent from Henrietta or her family has caused concerns on the unethical behavior of those involved, we have to consider the positive developments that have stemmed from such behavior. So it's one of those things, like, does one thing outweigh the other, and do the ends justify the means? And from my point of view, I feel like so much good has come from it, but that doesn't take away what happened to her family and her specifically. And I think we've come a long way in fixing ethical behavior, but not fixing, actually, I shouldn't say that. Learning about certain things that are unethical and trying to do them the right way. But that doesn't mean that that's happening today. There's still unethical behaviors happening all the time. And I think that's important as citizens, that we are aware that these things can happen, and to question and to always be, vigilant of what's going on around us. Next slide.
Okay, going off of that, I had kind of written a slide about a thought on how can we make sure that Henrietta is talked about and her name is out there, and how teachers specifically can enforce that in the classroom and make sure that it's something that students learn. So from our textbook, How People Learn, I said that there was a quote that said that teachers typically do not look to research for guidance. The language used by researchers is very different from that familiar to teachers. And that kind of also goes off of what Kelsey said about questioning things and being aware and learning. If teachers take the time to look at scientific research and understand it and put that in a form that students can understand, then it allows them to teach it to their students. Using the specific example of HeLa cells, we can use the awareness of it through, I came up with 3 solutions. One can be to have students write about whether they think the scientists were unethical, how, why not, that kind of situation. You can also have a conversation about how HeLa cells allow for the teaching of minority treatment within the US, not just in the medical field, but in any aspect of society. You can also do science experiments where students must follow scientific protocol using the correct laws and ethics, which were not done by the scientists with Henrietta cells. So all 3 of those examples can be ways that you use multiple disciplines in order to teach science to students.
And then finally, here are some conclusions that we had sort of drawn, given the experiences that the Lacks family went through. So this is just like what we learned about in terms of application to teaching in a classroom. So first and foremost, knowledge needs a strong foundation. This is because those initial understandings can have a powerful effect on the integration of new concepts and information. Sometimes those understandings are accurate, providing a foundation for building. So you're not going to be able to participate in society as a well-informed citizen if you do not have a strong foundation in terms of knowledge. And we saw that issue sort of arise within the Lacks family in terms of their lack of knowledge regarding science. And then given that, we also concluded that in a classroom, we should make sure that students are well informed about science and kept up to date with everything that's going around them. So as discussed, Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, is like a prime example because she suffered greatly since she misunderstood science and everything that she read from the articles or saw on the TV. She was essentially lost. And then I have a point here that the Lacks family was kept in the dark, not only because they were deceived, but because they did not understand the research HeLa cells were being used for, and their misunderstandings were never corrected. Therefore, they kind of misconstrued everything that they read about online about what was going on. And then finally, given all that, students learn new knowledge by building off of information that they already know. Therefore, as educators, we should make sure that the knowledge our students are building off of is accurate. So when students come into the classroom, we should try to gauge like the information they already know and make sure that they're all on the right track to then learn new information. Next slide. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.